So this is the mock-up for like the intro to the book. It's a facsimile of the newspaper that they publish. And I was trying to capture like the tone of the overall book. You know, there's stories that are very factual, kind of historically based in here, but there's also kind of a little bit of a science fiction-y element to the world that they live in. So it's kind of alternate. It's very much an alternate history because some things have not unfolded as we know. And I'm going to read like the last story because it's the shortest one. And when I finish, we'll stop passing and I'll pass the torch to someone else. So this story is called The Radiant Cities by Solomon King. And Solomon King is the publisher of the Vanguard. So this is kind of like a story that he's written. Flying into Blakestown, Cuba today, even the most cosmopolitan of travelers cannot help but be astounded by the breathtaking splendor of the cityscape with its blend of futuristic Western, Nouveau African, and Chinese architecture. The towering structures of steel and glass interspersed with spherical silicon structures are set in a complex geometric configurations amidst the unspoiled natural landscape of the oldest Afro-American sovereign state in the Western Hemisphere. Despite the decades-long U.S. trade embargo, Cuba's second-largest urban center continues to thrive, as evidenced by one of the highest literacy rates in the Western Hemisphere. With a population of only 350,000, Blakestown is an urban oasis whose splendor is rivaled only by its sister city, Imperium, in the Lone Star State. Long before the black townships of Nicodemus, Langston, Greenwood, or Soulsville, there were the city-states that seem now myths from a bygone age: Blakestown, Cuba, Tunisia, Georgia, and Imperium, Texas. In the wake of the Civil War, 4 million black Americans sought to carve out a place for themselves in a hostile country built on the backs of their enslaved ancestors. Suddenly released from bondage, most had little more than the tattered clothes on their backs with which to sow the fertile soil of dreams long deferred. Many remained enmeshed in refined systems of oppression in the New South. Others set out for the frontiers where they braved new challenges and established new communities. A decade ahead of this great migration, there was the Cuban Revolution led by Henry Holland Blake, founder of Blakestown. Born into slavery in the West Indies and later sold to Southern aristocrats, Enrico Blakes, or Henry Holland Blake, as he would come to be known, was atypical of the black men of his era. Dark-skinned, with a gaze that seemed to smolder even under an overseer's lash, Blake displayed qualities that led many of his brethren to the hanging tree. He was outspoken, literate, and inquiring, dangerous qualities for an enslaved person to possess at a time when the hard-won and fleeting freedoms of Reconstruction were yet undreamt of. According to legend, his master, Ezekiel Thomas Blake, is said to have tried unsuccessfully to sell the bonds child at the age of 12, when he discovered young Blake surreptitiously teaching himself to read. Of course, as with so many of the tales surrounding Blake, it's difficult to distill fact from fiction. What is known is that in 1853, Blake, then a runaway slave, traveled the length and breadth of the southern states, Canada, and Cuba, carrying with him a vision of freedom passed by word of mouth from bondsman to bondsman. A fugitive in the era of the infamous Dred Scott decision, he moved through Dixie like a phantom, finding refuge amidst other slaves, posing here as a seaman, there as a valet. He preached a sermon of self-deliverance in midnight whispers, drafting a blueprint for revolution in the oral tradition of his African forebears. Within 2 years, Blake's militant griots manifesto had given birth to an international freedom movement spearheaded by superbly trained Cuban forces, the Army of Emancipation of Oppressed Men and Women, a multicultural militia composed of Amerindians, Cuban Chinese, and free people of mixed racial heritage. Blake's War exploded on the international stage in the spring of 1858. Guerrilla forces in the southern United States, Canada, Liberia, and other West African nations soon joined Cuban revolutionaries in a campaign that sent shockwaves across the colonial world and ignited tensions that eventually sparked the American Civil War. In the decades following the war, the emancipated Republic of Cuba struggled to maintain its independence under the ever-looming shadow of the U.S. and European resentment. While the revolution did not result in the sweeping racial political reformation that Blake had hoped for, it did spur other radicals, such as Tunis Campbell, to champion their own struggles to establish autonomous black communities within the lower 48. When Campbell seized control of St. Catherine's Island off the coast of Georgia in 1865, no one would have imagined that he would become the architect of the first independent colony within U.S. borders. He and his band of refugees established a thriving agricultural base, created schools and universities, and had their own militia, which in 1866 engaged in what has since become a legendary battle with what many at the time called the forces of evil, but which more sober historians have explained as a battle for land rights against the defeated planter aristocracy. Fact or fiction, the reality of Tunis Campbell's legacy of education, civic engagement, and social justice advocacy is unassailable, and despite political and economic hardships that have besieged the island for decades, that legacy is embodied in the hearts of those still bearing the torch of the founder's vision. Tunisia served as both symbol and blueprint for a growing black independence movement. Belton Piedmont and Bernard Belgrade, whose shadow federation, Imperium in Imperial, employed what author and social activist Sutton E. Griggs has called the science of collective efficiency, a community-based approach to leadership that invited a wide range of strategic methodologies to engage social justice issues in another testament to black genius. From its original base in Waco, Texas, the Imperium's underground movement used guerrilla actions, fierce political rhetoric, literary and artistic propaganda to leverage economic and political power. All of this bolstered by black technological and scientific advances pioneered by Professor George Washington Carver and posthumously discovered inventions of legendary science patriot Benjamin Banneker. Sadly, no official records document the number of black townships established during the last 50 years, nor how many have disappeared. Communities in Rosewood, Florida, Tulsa, Oklahoma, Nicodemus, Kansas, continue to flourish, while a host of others have succumbed to racial violence, economic sabotage, and the pernicious indifference of democratically elected government representatives. In this time of global upheaval and uncertainty, we urge our readers to look to Blakestown, Tunisia, and Imperium as singular exemplars of African creativity and tenacity, our radiant cities of resistance.